Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah and this is my Granny Era. This is my weekly wrap up for everything that I've read for the last week. I have 4 books here and then I'll talk about what I am currently reading. So I'm actually going to go in backwards order because that just happens to be the order in which I enjoyed them. So we'll start with the one that I enjoyed the most first. So that is the Vinland Sagas. This is by various Norsemen and translated by Magnus Magnusson and Herman Paulson. So this is my second read through actually of the Vinland Sagas. I read this probably about 15 years ago for a college class on the Vikings and enjoyed it. And so I read it again this last week for the event called Sagalong, which is an event that is hosted in April where we basically just read a medieval Icelandic saga. It's hosted by Revenant Reads and some other co-hosts. I'll put a link so you guys can check that out in the description box. You have a whole month to participate and it's just a couple of hours read tops. And that's if you like read the introduction and, you know, look up some stuff and all that. It's a super short read. I think each of these sagas were maybe 20 pages. And it basically tells the story of Eric the Red, his son Leif Erikson, or Leif the Lucky, the colony that they made in Greenland of Icelanders, and then their subsequent travels to the North American continent. So some places in Canada and also along the northern east coast of the United States, there is evidence that these Norsemen were here long before Christopher Columbus and other explorers of that age, right? So they're fun stories and you learn a lot about the culture and the people of that time. It's kind of one of those jumping off, you know, places where, okay, I learned this, now I want to go learn more. And there's a lot out there to research on the Vikings in North America. And the little colony, I don't know how to pronounce it because it's French and I know zip about French, but there is a place, like I believe it's a national park or just a national set-aside territory in northern Canada where there's lots of evidence of a Viking settlement and you can go and visit, and lots of research and, you know, digs and things have been done there. So Vinland Sagas, super fun, super quick. If you haven't picked them up yet, you can probably find some version translation online and check them out and join us for Sagalong. All right, second up is this story called Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. Now, it sounds like this book was controversial within the Black community when it first was published or made known, because this book tells the story of the last African person to be purchased and brought into the United States as a slave. It happened approximately 50 years after it became illegal to actually go to, you know, the African continent and purchase or kidnap, you know, people and bring them back here for slavery. That became illegal in the early 1800s, even though slavery itself wasn't outlawed until many decades later. From that point on, they had to just kind of make do with what was already here in America. And so, you know, the children of slaves and things like that. And so anyway, so 50-ish years after the, you know, crossing the Atlantic to participate in slave trade was made illegal, somebody did it illegally and secretly, you know, they went over and got a shipload of people and brought them back here. And because very few people wanted to be caught with, you know, having these slaves that had been obtained illegally, then they had a hard time selling them. And so they sold some of them and split the rest up between them. And as far as we know, that was the last time that somebody attempted to do that. So that's pretty heartbreaking for this guy and his fellow, you know, Africans. But the part that became very controversial within the Black community, I think, is that this guy tells the story of the different tribal, you know, feuds over there and how it was other African people who sold him to the slave traders. It was his fellow countrymen that sold him. And it talks about some pretty brutal things. It talks about punishments that are given to murderers and other criminals. And they're very brutal and they're very inhumane. And I think that at a time, especially when the Black community was trying to, be seen as equal humans, right? Because there's a lot of people who would say that they weren't even full humans, and that's their excuse for abusing them in the way that they did. At a time when the Black community was, trying to make the point that they are equal humans with all other races, to have it come out that their countrymen were so brutal and so just animalistic almost in the way that they treated criminals, and just in some of the practices that these tribes had, that people in America would see that as inhuman, right? Like no real human would do that. And so I think that is the biggest reason why this was so controversial. I can totally understand that. But this book was republished with a whole bunch of edits and explanations and apologies, and I think I would have enjoyed this if I just could get the story that Zora Neale Hurston wrote. The actual story of this man is only about 20-ish pages long. The book itself is like 150-ish, because this editor, Deborah G. Plant, had to start off with introductions and explanations. They have Alice Walker writing a foreword, and then extras at the end, asking the question of whether or not Hurston committed plagiarism, and then making all excuses of why it would be okay for her to commit plagiarism, and then apologizing for it. And it's just so much extra stuff that like 99.9% of her readers wouldn't even have known that in her very early days of journalism, she, copied down some stuff without citing her sources. I just feel like nobody even would have known that, and why even bring that up, right? She went on to be a fantastic author of I think 4 novels, lots of other writing. I don't know, it was just so much, and I think it was just filler, right? I think this is a really important work, and it offers a lot of perspective that people in America, even African American people today, probably don't realize about, the African country and the tribal government. It talked about things like the fat house, where men would send their fiancés to get fattened up before they got married, because that was more attractive for them to be very, obese, I guess. And so that was just interesting. And I guess that's still a thing in a couple of areas. There are some stories after the interview that Hurston actually has with this guy that are kind of like his stories that he would tell her. Like, she'd go over there and they'd hang out and they'd eat peaches on the porch and he'd tell her stories, I guess. So there's a couple of stories in there of just his, folklorish sort of things. But for the most part, it's fairly short. It's just some short interviews, her asking questions about his time before he was sold, his time on the trip over here, and then they go into, his life as a slave. He didn't end up being in slavery very long, just about 5 years, I think, before everything, was done and they were emancipated. But anyway, interesting read. If you can skip all of the extras, then it's a super quick read. I'm glad I read it, but I would have liked to hear more from Zora Neale Hurston and less from Deborah G. Plant. All right, and then before that, I read Agnes Grey, which I was finishing up for the Bronte March on the Moors reading event. And this was the group read. So this is all I got done. I actually wanted to read another Bronte mystery, but I started it and it wasn't all that great. So I decided just to move into April and start People April and read the book, the Barracoon book. So I read this about 10 years ago, and at that time I was just like, kind of dull, boring, lifeless creature, Agnes Grey. I read it again, and I really haven't changed my mind any. I've always said that Wuthering Heights is the most depressing book I've ever read, but it does have like a plot to redeem itself, and you know, some suspense and some curious things and atmosphere and all of that. Agnes Grey is like the most depressing book ever written, but it has no plot and it has no interesting parts. It's just, she was a governess for a really bad family. She was a governess for a not so bad family. Then something super predictable happens and then we're done. And it's just, there's just not a whole lot of anything. There's just no plot. In fact, at one point in the book, the narrator actually acknowledges the fact that the reader is probably pretty sick of her. And I'm like, yeah, we kind of are. Just lots of complaining, right? But the one thing I think that does redeem Agnes Grey in my eyes is she doesn't put up with pious mansplainers very much when it comes to religious matters. She's very opinionated and just, you know, steady on what she believes religiously, so she doesn't really wimp out at all regarding that kind of stuff. She has a lot of opinions about religious men who think too highly of themselves, and I'm like, yeah, I can kind of relate with you there. I think that really what this book is it's Anne Bronte's way of providing a social commentary on the injustices of her society, but doing so in a passive way and in a way that would be accepted for her sex and for her time. I've never really cared much for either of Anne's novels, though I do think she was probably a pretty sweet, little, quiet, mousy sort of a person. And I think this is just her way of like making her voice heard, right? So I appreciate it for what it is, but it's not anything that I would be like, hey, I haven't read that in a while. I should pick up Agnes Grey. Nah, I can do fine without reading that again. All right, before that, I read The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So this was my children's classic reading event pick for the month of March for the read along. But it was also the pick of several other reading events. It was the middle grade March pick for the read along and some other stuff. So anyway, everybody was reading The Secret Garden in March, and I think everybody's just like, wee, spring. But we here in Northwest Arkansas are under severe weather watch and have been for a couple of days and will be for a couple more days. And so spring for us means hide in the basement under a mattress. Pray for your life. But those of you who have gentle springs, I'm glad that you got to enjoy it coming in like a lamb. I didn't enjoy The Secret Garden so much. This was my 7th time reading it as far as I've recorded, and I did not enjoy it as much. I think that it's kind of like Little Women has been for me in the last couple of years, and even Wuthering Heights, dare I say it, my favorite book in the whole world. I'm just picking up a whole lot more on the Victorian melodrama, and I think it's irritating me. And I'm just like, no, am I moving past this? Like, am I going some other direction in my reading enjoyment, you know, and preferences? Because, I don't know if I'm ready for that. But there's a lot of melodrama, especially from Colin, and I just wasn't having it this time. You know, and maybe that's just because, like, I've been mothering for 25 years now, and so maybe it's the whiny, melodramatic, ultra-feminine little boys that are just bugging me. I don't know. Could be. But I did not enjoy it as much. I still saw the beauty in it. One thing that I did notice that I hadn't noticed before was she had, like, fabric on her walls. What am I trying to say? Like silk, you know, like wallpaper, but it was made of fabric. And I've seen that before. When I was touring, I can especially remember I was touring Warwick Castle, and in one of the bedrooms, there is this gorgeous, like, robin egg blue silk, I think, fabric on the walls, like, as we would hang up wallpaper. It wasn't just like a hanging tapestry. It was literally what they covered the walls with. And I was like, that is gorgeous. But, you know, you couldn't touch it, right? Because you'd be, like, making little weird thingies in it all the time. You'd be catching it on things. But anyway, she had that in her home when she moved into Misselthwaite Manor. That was on her wall. So I didn't pick up on that before. So I thought that was cool. It was nice to imagine that. But I don't know. I just wasn't in the mood, I guess. I'm sorry. Another thing that bugged me was at one point in the novel, she says something like the narrator says, something like the kids had a great time and grew a lot in the garden, you know, whatever, however she said it. But they were having a great time. They were growing a lot in the garden. But if you've never had a garden, then you can't possibly understand what I'm talking about. And I'm like, you are literally writing a book about little kids in a garden. So isn't it kind of your job to help me understand how fantastic this garden with the kids in it really is? So is it my reading of this book completely pointless because I will just never possibly be able to understand the levels at which this, I mean, it just sounds sort of pretentious to me. Pretentious gardening. So yeah, I probably wasn't in the mood, and I'm sorry if I wrecked it for anybody who just was like totally in love and it was your favorite read of March, but I'll probably put it away for a while. Finally, the other thing, and this is not the author's fault, but my book looks like this for the last chapter or so. So the bottom part is cut off and all the page numbers are cut off, and then the top is pieces from the beginning of the story. And so, you know, obviously just a misprint, but I was like, what? But it was a good thing I had like 4 other copies. So I just grabbed another copy and finished the book off. But I had picked this one because I think I already told you guys this, but I picked this one because it has artwork by Tasha Tudor, who I love. So I'll have to look for this edition again. I actually found a copy on eBay. Did I tell you guys this? Maybe I did. It was signed. It was only like $30. And I was like, maybe I want that for my collection. All right, anyway, so that is what I read in the last week-ish. And now I am just so excited. I'm reading The Bone Chests by Kat Jarman. This book, I talk all about it in my Historathon Q2 video. So I'm not going to go into the whole thing again. You guys can just watch the Historathon Q2 video because I think I talk about it first, or one of the first ones, because it's the one I've been most excited about reading. It talks all about Winchester Cathedral and the bone chests there. It goes all the way back to when those people that were in the bone chests, when they lived, and why they might have ended up in the bone chests at Winchester Cathedral. So just to make it super quick, at Winchester Cathedral, there are these wooden chests. They're all decorated beautifully, and inside are bones of really old people, kings and bishops. There's a queen in there, and there's a sheep in there, and I don't know what else. Lots of bones. They're said to be the bones of the people who are written on the boxes, right? So just like 1 or 2 people per box. And it's supposed to be like their ancient important kings and bishops of Winchester. Well, in 16-something, when the English Civil War was going on, the bad guys rode into the cathedral and opened up the bone chest and threw all the bones out the window and smashed it all up, and all the stained glass was all over the floor and the bones were all over the floor. And so over time, they collected the bones and put them back in the boxes all willy-nilly, and nobody knows where anything goes. And then they collected all the glass and they put it back in the cathedral window in this big kaleidoscopy pattern that no longer is, you know, pictures like it was before they busted it all out. Now it's just this big kaleidoscope, but it's still super cool. You should look it up if you haven't looked that up online. Look up the stained glass window at the front of Winchester Cathedral. It's made up of all these little fragments from them busting them out, right? And so this tells the story of not only the process of like figuring out whose bones are whose, but who they are, right? So like kind of their history. And just the steps that they have taken over time to kind of, you know, research and match people up. And in so doing, they found out that there's actually like over 24 different parts of bodies in all of this. And so how did that happen? Well, probably because they dug up bones from older cemeteries with unmarked graves. And so they're kind of like, I think this is where King so-and-so was buried. Let's just take a few from the area just in case. Like, I don't know. Is that how they did it? I'm not sure. But somehow they ended up with sheep in there. So anyway, it's just very interesting. I'm about 80. Oh, I am on page 80 right now. And I'm hoping to finish that over the weekend. I'm going to have a lot of reading time this weekend. So I am just eating it up. So it's really well written, but there is a lot of English history. And so I think that I'm glad that, one, I can picture these things in my head because I've been there a lot, and you know, it's just one of those things you just always kind of pay attention to. The tour guides always love to tell the story because it's a cool story for the cathedral. Well, it's a horrific story for the cathedral, but it's cool now, right? And now that everything's put back together. And so you hear the story and you hear it from different people and their different way of telling it and their different perspectives and the things that they like to add on to, right? The different tour guides. But so I can picture all of this in my head, but then also I'm just glad that I have had a little bit of time to sort of get the basics on really old English history and the different people, you know, and the places and that kind of stuff, and just kind of how it went and who was where and where did they come from and stuff. Because I think that I would struggle to really, I mean, I think I probably would really struggle with this book if I didn't have some background. And it's just one of those things that probably not everybody would just grab it, right? And be like, wow, that's so interesting. I wonder. But I think that there's enough people, obviously, who have had the same kind of experiences that I've had that can really just let their imagination go with this book and just be so absorbed into it. So I think I'm just the right audience, right? Because a lot of this stuff, like, I don't know, I'm assuming if you grew up as, you know, in English schools, that some of the stuff is just like, oh, here we go again. Like kind of how I feel about the Old West, right? And all the pioneer stuff and all the Old Westies, shootouts, gold rush, covered wagon, Little House on the Prairie. I'm still into Lewis and Clark a little bit, but just like that whole like 1800s America, I'm just so done. Like, I don't like to read about it because that's where I grew up, and that's all we ever learned, right? The history of the area we lived in. So I think maybe because this is like fascinating to me, and all of the information I'm getting is like stuff that I never knew. I didn't grow up learning, but I've done my own personal study over the years and all of that. I think that I'm probably a good audience for all of the back historical information that is included in this book to sort of, yes, fill it out, but it's good. I'm just loving it. Okay. That's all I got. Let me know what you guys are reading and how your reading week has gone. Hope everybody's doing good. I will see you soon. Bye-bye.